Hi, my name is Debbie Manns. I'm the Executive Director and Baykeeper for New York, New Jersey Baykeeper. I was also a member of the Q Sustainable Jersey Brownfields Task Force. Today we're going to talk about the cleanup of brownfield or contaminated sites. It's often a complex and difficult process, and that's why it's important that Green Team members understand their role and the municipality's role in cleaning up these sites. Due to the complexity, the Rutgers Center for Urban Environmental Sustainability, or CUES, and Sustainable Jersey created a Brownfield task force to develop a Brownfield action item. The task force has developed this video in order to help Green Team members understand the cleanup process and the roles of environmental professionals. Today we're joined by Caroline Ehrlich, a Chief of Staff and Director of the Redevelopment Agency for the Township of Woodbridge and a Sustainable Jersey trustee, and Bill Call, a professional geologist and a licensed site remediation professional, Vice President of Penn Jersey Environmental Consulting and an LSRPA board member. The New Jersey Site Environmental Reform Act, or SARA, governs the brownfield remediation process and reuse. And the goal of SARA was to increase the speed of remediation in order to decrease the threat of contamination to the public and environmental health and safety, and return underutilized properties to productive uses as quickly as possible. With limited exceptions, the site contamination investigation, cleanup, remediation, and the final closeout are under the supervision of licensed site remediation professionals, or LSRPs. SARA requires that remedial actions directed by an LSRP must follow New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, or DEP, regulations. LSRP decisions are not subject to DEP approval, although DEP does review forms submitted to the department by the LSRP. So this sounds complex, and we thought maybe the best way to address it was to do a question and answer series with Bill and Caroline. So Bill, I want to start with you. Are there different rules for cleaning up an industrial site versus a residential site versus a site that might be used for recreational open space?
Yes, an industrial site is usually cleaned up to what's called non-residential standards, which are less strict than the residential cleanup standards. Residential, open space, recreation type properties are typically remediated to a residential standard, again, depending on the end use selected for the site.
And Caroline, what's the municipal perspective on these types of uses?
Well, very often the use is determined by either a redevelopment plan or the zoning plan. Being that the municipality, though, actually can write those redevelopment plans, sometimes we marry the amount of cleanup that we want with the use. For instance, we have a transit village that we have called the Avenel Arts Village, which was a highly contaminated general dynamics site, and it's gone into the neighborhoods. They have groundwater monitoring. So we wanted the heaviest possible cleanup that we could have so that, you know, we could get rid of as much of the source of the contamination. So therefore, we went with residential, so that we could get that cleanup, that they had to do that cleanup. It did take us 8 years to find a developer that was willing to make that investment, but that was important to us. In industrial areas where we don't care and they're just warehouses, the industrial level is still good, and the warehouse becomes part of the cap. So it all depends.
So Bill, what is the role of the LSRP in this whole process?
The LSRP is hired to conduct and oversee the cleanup, investigation, remediation of a site. Their highest priority is protection of public health, safety, and the environment, and they make sure the cleanup and investigations are done per DEP regulations to meet or achieve DEP cleanup standards.
And Caroline, municipalities can hire LSRPs themselves. Can you talk about when that might happen?
Sometimes we obtain properties either through foreclosure or condemnation, and we would, if they're contaminated, we would need an LSRP to help us clean it up. Occasionally there are problems on township property. We had an underground storage tank in a house that I think we probably got through foreclosure, and we discovered that it had ruptured and gone to the next door neighbor. So, you know, we needed the LSRP for that.
So Bill, what do you need to do to qualify to be an LSRP?
Well, in order to be qualified to sit for the exam, which is administered by the state, you typically are required to have a bachelor degree in either an engineering or science discipline, 8 years professional experience, progressive experience in the field, 5 years of which and 5,000 hours of which have to be conducted in the state of New Jersey. Also, you have to take the 40-hour OSHA hazardous waste health and safety training, and you are subject to fairly rigorous continuing education requirements.
Thanks. And when in a contaminated site or brownfield cleanup process, do you need an LSRP?
I would recommend getting an LSRP right off the bat, first stage of the process. They will review a case file, review the environmental information for a site, probably conduct a preliminary assessment to determine if there's any environmental issues with the site, and then they'll guide their client through the investigation cleanup process and respond to public inquiries as needed.
And so that's the investigation and characterization of a site. What about when it's under active cleanup? Is there still a role for an LSRP?
Yes, the LSRP will develop the cleanup plan and implement it. They will collect all the scientific data and issue that and communicate that information to the client and the DEP.
So, Caroline, how do you find an LSRP? What's been your experience at that?
What the township has done is we have put out an RFQ, also known as a request for qualifications, and the engineering firms submit their qualifications. We then form a pool, and out of that pool we will, as we have a need for an LSRP, we will pick one of the engineering firms and get a proposal from them.
Mm-hmm. So Bill, if let's say your township hasn't done this or you are a private entity, how would they find an LSRP?
An LSRP, the list of LSRPs is maintained on the NJDEP data miner site. Any citizen can go, or remediating party can go look for an LSRP, get their contact information, phone number, license number, etc. When a remediating responsible party wants to hire an LSRP, we'd recommend they get a written proposal which outlines their scope of work, their budget, their schedule. If the LSRP or their firm is not willing to issue a written proposal, we would recommend going out and getting another firm or a pool of firms potentially to bid on a project. The LSRP Association also can assist folks trying to find a member or an LSRP in a certain area.
And so you mentioned already that the responsible party, or sometimes known as the polluter, can hire an LSRP. How much could this cost?
Well, the costs of a project can vary on site conditions and size and complexity, soil or groundwater contamination. There's also, and also the source of funding can impact the cost. There's also a program called Technical Assistance Grants, or TAG grants, which are available to qualified community or environmental groups to retain their own LSRP to review a project and advise that group on
Bill,
progress.
could a green team use that?
You should be able to. There is a form that's filled out and submitted to the state in order to qualify, and the grant amounts up to $20,000.
And in your experience in a municipality, who often will cover the cost of an LSRP, or how could that range?
We've been very fortunate to get HDSRF grants, which is a program that the state runs. Out of that money actually comes out of the corporate tax. And in the case that I mentioned before, where we had a tank that ruptured, we actually belonged to a environmental joint insurance fund, and our insurance covered the cost. And frankly, quite often, it just comes out of the taxpayer dollar.
So Bill, let me ask you, what is the relationship between the LSRP and the site owner?
Well, an LSRP is an individual licensed professional retained by a remediating party, often the polluter, but sometimes not. The person responsible for conducting remediation, whether it be a township or a private entity, will retain an LSRP to make sure the cleanup and the investigation are done per state regulations and cleanup standards.
So then what's the relationship between the LSRP and the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection?
The LSRP will conduct work and submit reports to the state to be reviewed and inspected. If the DEP finds a particular cleanup doesn't meet standards, they can rescind the final remediation document, which is referred to as a response action outcome, or an RAO.
Okay, great. So Caroline, how would a resident or a member of the Green Team, who would they contact to get information about a brownfield in their community?
Well, one of the actions that we're actually encouraging through the Brownfield Task Force is for the townships to develop a brownfield website that would have an inventory of all of the sites and the priority sites for the township, why they're priorities, and as much information as you can put on there. If they haven't done that and a resident still wants to get information, there is a requirement, and Bill can help me with this, that the LSRP has to send a notice to the neighbors and also something to the town. And that usually, at least in our town, is kept by the town engineer.
Yeah, the LSRP, as they conduct their work, have to submit their reports or key documents to the state, the county, and the municipality.
So, but Bill, what could an LSRP be doing as best or better practices in a community to make sure that information is getting out to the residents?
Again, the remediating party will often ask the LSRP to be a point person for contact. The remediating party has the responsibility legally to answer inquiries from the public. Usually, folks from the public will call the LSRP. Again, they sign or a notice has been posted. They will call the LSRP and ask for information. Again, that's 90% of the time. If a LSRP or the remediating party is non-responsive, they can, the interested individual can contact the DEP Office of Community Relations. I should mention also that if a remediating party is not meeting their obligations for public notification when required, there's significant fines. A $10,000 penalty can be assessed, as well as a notice of violation issued.
And can the LSRP release information to the Green Team or municipality? What would this information look like?
Typically, as the LSRP generates their scientific data, the reports are fairly voluminous, but again, they're submitted to the DEP, and an OPRA request can be submitted to the state to get them shortly after submittal.
And what kind of time frame would it be from, let's say, activities occurring on the site and reports would have to be submitted to DEP, and then that's information available to the public?
The LSRP usually, as we talked about earlier, will usually conduct a preliminary assessment, the historical research, some initial sampling. That's called a preliminary assessment or site investigation report. That usually takes about 6 to 12 months for most sites. If the interested party is looking to get that information when complete, again, they can go through the OPRA process at the state, because that report has to be submitted.
And Caroline, when we were talking earlier, before we started, you had mentioned an interesting best practice that the Township of Woodbridge does with respect to monthly meetings.
On some of our bigger cleanups, I have monthly meetings with the LSRP and also the developer, and they have always, to each one, have been very forthcoming, and it's been a wonderful dialogue. And then, of course, if the municipality has the information, we can share it with our council people, so they know, and with our residents and the Green Team.
And the Green Team, of course. That's great. So, who supervises the LSRP?
The the licensing board oversees LSRPs. It's an independent entity. It publishes rules, conducts disciplinary proceedings, administers the licensing exam, and investigates all complaints related to LSRPs. Any citizen can submit a complaint if they have a problem with an LSRP. The assistant commissioner of the NJDEP also sits as a chairman of the licensing board.
Okay, great. Well, this has been really informative. I mean, Caroline, as we close out, can you tell us the significance of what this program has meant and the importance of addressing brownfields in your community?
Many towns are almost embarrassed to say that they have brownfields. There's a stigma to them. We in Woodbridge, and I think every town should, kind of see this as an opportunity. And it's just a win-win for us because you get a developer in, the brownfield gets cleaned up, the contamination is gone, then you get redevelopment, and you get tax rateables. We have millions and millions and millions of dollars have been added to our tax base. And we've seen the benefits in the town from football fields to new auditoriums in our school. And so it's just been a great win-win. We
That's
have
great.
cleaner properties and great development.
All right. Well, thank you both for talking with me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.